Well, we've been talking about the Vietnam War the last few lessons, and we talked about how the United States got involved in Vietnam, and then we talked about how the United States escalated its involvement in the war. Now, as the war progressed, we had hundreds of thousands of young men that were over there fighting and dying, and of course, the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese that were being killed during this war. Eventually, what happens, it's a very long war. It goes on for almost 11 years. What happens is people begin to question, hey, is this something we should really be involved with? And the politicians that have told us this is a good war, is it really the kind of war that they had suggested that it was? What ends up growing out of this questioning was something that really from the government standpoint was a very dangerous thing, as the people began to question, they began to ask questions. And we talked about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and that really showed that, yes, several presidents had been lying to the American people about the purpose and what exactly was going on in the war. I'm going to spend this next few lessons talking about the anti-war movement. Now, this is not just a single group of people. One thing they do have in common is they want to end the war in Vietnam, but they come from different places. We're going to talk about the hippies. We're also going to talk about the civil rights leaders. We're going to talk about anti-draft, people who were upset about the draft itself. And then we're going to talk about something kind of generic called the peace movement. But all these people get together and they create something called the anti-war movement. Now, like I said, the first group of people I want to talk about are the hippies. Now, the beatniks, these were people that preceded the hippies, but the hippies were most familiar with. Now, there was a very famous phrase that they had that said, don't trust anyone over 30. This was a generation that really, really did not trust the older generation, and there was quite a rift or quite a space between the older generation and these younger generations. They were also known as the countercultural movement because they really were fighting the culture that had existed during this golden era of the 1950s and in the early 1960s. They really were trying to change the culture of America. Now, they did see the world very, very differently than their parents or their grandparents saw it. Now, remember that their parents or their grandparents fought in World War II, and they were very good soldiers. They were used to trusting the government, trusting the military, and if they were asked to do something, they did it. These hippies really took a very different approach, and they said, no, we're going to question everything that we're asked to do. There's a very famous phrase called turn on, tune in, and drop out. And it was coined by a guy by the name of Timothy Leary. Now, Timothy Leary was a professor, a psychology professor at Harvard University, and he began doing studies using LSD because he thought LSD had some therapeutic value, that it could help people during counseling sessions. Now, keep in mind that LSD, until about 1970, LSD was legal, so these were legal drugs that were being used on a university in studies. Now, Timothy Leary fell in love so much with LSD, he began to distribute it just amongst students on Harvard campus, and Harvard got very nervous about it. They're a very conservative university, and they got nervous and he was dismissed. Well, Timothy Leary then ended up crisscrossing the country and trying to expose as many people as he could to what he thought were the beneficial properties of LSD. Now, LSD, you've probably heard some stories about LSD, but you've got to, it is so incredibly important that I think it's safe to say that you would not have a hippie movement without LSD. It really was the key drug that drove the ideas and the lifestyle of the hippies. So anyway, with that combined with their ideas, combined with the heavy drug use, with the idea that they saw the world very differently, this was that generation. They did come up with a very famous phrase too, make love, not war. They were all about peaceful demonstrations and a peaceful lifestyle. Now, they were very much criticized by their older generation. For the most part, their parents were really upset that these kids had turned hippie, and of course their grandparents were very upset, maybe even a little disgusted that these people saw the world so differently than them. But they were the first group that I want to talk about that really began to question authority and really came out strongly against the Vietnam War.